Alright, so previously we have had an introduction about lipids where we looked at the various important functions which lipids carry out. Now we are going to proceed with the classification of lipids. In this lecture, we are going to talk about different types of lipids and their functions. This slide shows the various different types of lipids, including fatty acids, triacylglycerols, glycerophospholipids, sphingolipids, and sterols. In this lecture, we are going to study about these various types one by one. This is a chart which summarizes various different types of lipids. Certain lipids, like triacylglycerols, are meant for storage. These are formed by a condensation reaction between glycerol and fatty acids. The resulting molecules are called as triacylglycerols. Sometimes they are also called as triglycerides. They are meant for storing energy. Animals, for example, store energy in form of fats. The cells which store fats are called as adipocytes. Adipocytes, they contain triacylglycerol in them. The other type are the lipids which are found in the membrane. One such type present in the membrane are called as phospholipids. Others are glycolipids. As the name say, these lipids they are conjugates with carbohydrates. In the coming slides, we will look at the detailed structure of these various different types of lipids. So the first one in this regard are the fatty acids. Fatty acids are those acids which eat a lot and hence become fat. Well, that was just a joke. This explanation is for those of you who might have taken it too literal. Anyway, to say it appropriately, fatty acids, they are hydrocarbons. They are such hydrocarbons which contain a carboxylic acid group on them, and they have a long chain hydrocarbon. Most of these fatty acids, they contain 14 to 20 carbons. Most of the fatty acids, they are esterified. That is, their carboxylic group undergoes a reaction to produce an ester. Most of the fatty acids present in animals and plants, they contain 16 and 18 carbons in them. Most of the fatty acids, they have an even number of carbons in them. Although odd chain fatty acids do exist, but most of the fatty acids found in living things, they contain an even number of carbon atoms in them. Some fatty acids, they are saturated. That is, they contain carbon-to-carbon single covalent bond. Others, they may be unsaturated. That is, they contain carbon-to-carbon double bonds in them. When carbon atoms form four single covalent bonds, the geometry of the molecule is tetrahedral as shown here. This is in case of saturated fatty acids that carbons are forming four single covalent bonds. However, when carbon is forming a double bond, which is in the case of unsaturated fatty acids, the bond angles and geometry is different. The carbon which is forming a double covalent bond is trigonal planar. So as you can see here in the figure below, the geometry of these two carbon atoms is different. The bond angles are also different. In case of tetrahedral geometry, that is single covalent bonds, The bond angles are 109.5 degrees. On the other hand, in case of a double bond, the bond angle is 120 degrees. So therefore, when carbon atoms form four single covalent bonds, or when they form a double covalent bond, the bond angles and the geometry of the molecule are different. This figure shows the structure of some common and important fatty acids. In this representation here, you can see a fatty acid which contains 18 carbons. The carbon atoms are numbered 1 through 18. Carbon number 1, sometimes which is also called as the alpha carbon. Carbon number 1 contains the carboxyl group. This 18 carbon saturated fatty acid is called as stearic acid. The next one shown here is also an 18 carbon fatty acid, but as you can see on carbon number 9, it has a double bond. So carbon 9 and carbon 10 of this fatty acid are linked through a double covalent bond. This fatty acid is called as oleic acid. The next one shown here is also an 18 carbon fatty acid, but this one contains two double bonds in it. One double bond is present between carbon number 9 and carbon 10. The next one is present between carbon number 12 and carbon 13. This fatty acid is linoleic acid. And the last one shown here is also an unsaturated fatty acid containing three double bonds in it, as represented here, between carbon 9, 10, 12, and 15, 16. This is alpha linoleic acid. It contains three double bonds in it. Such fatty acids, which contain more than one double bonds in them, that is, they are unsaturated, and contain several double bonds in them, are called as polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now note that stearic acid is a saturated fatty acids. All of the carbons, they have a bond angle of 109.5 degree in this case, because all of the carbon to carbon atoms are single covalent bonds. However, when double bonds are present in fatty acids, say for example oleic acid, it contains one double bond. The presence of double bonds results in change in the structure of this fatty acid because the bond angles across a double bond is 120 degree. For single covalent bonds, it is 109.5 degree. So presence of a double bond produces a kink or a bend in the molecule. Greater is the number of double bonds, more is the bend produced in the resulting fatty acid molecule. This is represented in the structure here. This is a structural representation of stearic acid, which is a saturated fatty acid. The carbon atoms are shown by means of gray circles, hydrogens are represented by white circles, and oxygen atoms are represented in red color. So this is carbon number 1, which contains the carboxyl group, and rest of the carbons are represented here. Since the bond angles are the same, so you can see that this molecule is a straight chain structure. The next one represented here is oleic acid. Oleic acid contains one double bond, which is present between carbon 9 and 10. So the bond angle here in this part of the molecule is different. So you can see here there is a kink in this molecule, a bend in the molecule. And the bend is present because of the reason that there is a double bond between these two carbons. And the bond angle here is 120 degree. So therefore presence of double bonds produces a kink or a bend in the molecule. This kink is further elaborated in the structure of linoleic acid. Linoleic acid contains two double bonds as represented here. This is also shown in this three-dimensional representation of the structure that you can see that the structure of linoleic acid contains these carbons engaged through double covalent bond, and therefore the kink is more pronounced here. So saturated fatty acids, they are forming straight structures. On the other hand, the unsaturated fatty acids which contain double bonds in them, they have a bend in the molecule. This table provides information about various different types of fatty acids. This is showing the saturated fatty acids here. The first number represents the number of carbon atoms in this fatty acid. After the colon, the second digit shows the number of double bonds in this molecule. So the saturated fatty acids are represented here, and the unsaturated are represented here. The common name of these fatty acids are listed in this column, and these are the systematic names of these fatty acids. You are required to know about the structure and the name of palmitic acid, which is a 16 carbon saturated fatty acid, and stearic acid, which is an 18 carbon saturated fatty acid. The systematic name of palmitic acid is hexadecanoic acid. Hexa means 6 and deca is 10. So hexadecanoic acid means having 16 carbons in it. The systematic name of stearic acid is octadecanoic acid. Octa means 8, deca means 10. So that is an 18 carbon fatty acid. You are required to remember the structure of stearic acid, oleic acid, linoleic acid, and alpha linoleic acid. In addition, you're also required to remember the structure of palmitic acid, which is a 16 carbon saturated fatty acid. The structures of these fatty acids are represented in the next column. The next important thing about fatty acids is called as the melting point. Sometimes is called as the melting temperature or the transition temperature. The fatty acids are nonpolar and are interacting with one another through hydrophobic interaction. They can exist in a gel-like solid phase, in which the lipids are interacting with one another in such a manner that they pack tightly with each other. As represented in this diagram, when they are tightly packed with each other, they act like a gel-like solid. But when they are loosely interacting with each other, they are more fluid. The transition temperature, which is also sometimes called as the melting temperature, is the temperature above which the lipids are going to be more fluid and below which the lipids are going to pack tightly with one another and are going to be gel-like solid. In this representation, the phospholipids of a membrane are shown. The melting temperature is affected by several important factors. If the temperature is more than the melting temperature of the lipids, those lipids are going to be in a fluid form. But if the given temperature is less than the melting temperature of the lipids, then those lipids are going to be present in a gel-like solid form. This is another representation of the structure of membrane lipids. Below the transition temperature, the lipids pack with each other very tightly and they form a gel-like structure. Above the melting temperature, the lipids have more energy and the molecules, they are more mobile, they are fluid-like, and their packaging is less tight. So when the temperature is less than the transition temperature, these lipids are going to form a gel-like structure. But when the temperature is more than the transition temperature, they are going to be fluid-like. This slide represents the structure of saturated fatty acid shown here and an unsaturated fatty acid shown here. You can see the point where the double bond is present, there is a kink in the molecule. Below in this panel, you can see that how these lipids are interacting with one another. If there are saturated fatty acids, they pack with one another tightly. However, if there are unsaturated fatty acids as well, the packaging ability is less. Because of the shape of the molecule, that is, the presence of the kink in the unsaturated fatty acids, they are unable to pack with each other very tightly. So therefore, those lipids which are rich in saturated fatty acids, their melting temperatures are high as compared to the lipids which contain unsaturated fatty acids in them. Plant oils are rich in unsaturated fatty acids. Animal fats, on the other hand, are rich in saturated fatty acids. So this is the reason that animal fats are solids at room temperature, because their transition temperature is higher by the presence of more saturated fatty acids in them. Plant oils are liquid because they contain a higher proportion of unsaturated fatty acids in them. Hence, their packaging is less effective, so their transition temperature is low. For this reason, they are in a liquid state at room temperature. This slide shows a comparison of various different types of lipids. One of the important factors which affect the melting point is the chain length. Greater is the chain length of lipids, more is the melting temperature of those fatty acids. Again, we refer back to the same table. So you can see lauric acid or dodecanoic acid, which is a 12 carbon fatty acid, the melting temperature is 44. Now you can see that as the chain length is increasing, 14 carbons, 16, 18, and so on, as the chain length is increasing, the melting temperature or the transition temperature of these lipids is also increasing. So one important factor governing the transition temperature or the melting temperature is the chain length. The melting temperature increases with the chain length. That means if lipids contain small fatty acids in them, their melting temperature is less. But if they contain longer fatty acids in them, the melting temperature is also higher. The other important factor which affects the melting temperature is the degree of unsaturation. More unsaturated fatty acids present in lipids, the transition temperature is less, or greater is the number of saturated fatty acids in lipids, the transition temperature is going to be higher. This is also depicted in the figure shown on the right. So here, this bar is representing beef fat, which is a solid at room temperature. This dark blue portion is representing the 16 and 18 carbon saturated fatty acids. You can see that the proportion of the saturated fatty acids is quite high in beef fat. Butter contains an intermediate degree of saturated fatty acids, and it is a semi-solid at room temperature. Plant oils have a less proportion of saturated fatty acids. They contain a higher degree of unsaturated fatty acids. So this light blue color shows the unsaturated fatty acids. So plant oils have less degree of saturated and a higher degree of unsaturated fatty acids in them. So therefore, they are liquid at room temperature. That is, their transition temperature is low. For this reason, plant oils which are rich in unsaturated fatty acids are generally preferred. Another important type of fatty acids which are beneficial for health are called as omega fatty acids. The figure below is showing the structure of a fatty acid. The carbons of fatty acids are numbered starting from the carboxyl group. So this is carbon number 1, carbon 2, 3, and so on. The carbon number 1 sometimes is also called as the alpha carbon because it contains the carboxyl functional group on it. So the standard method of numbering the carbons is from the carboxyl group. Sometimes this is also called as the alpha carbon. The last carbon of a fatty acid is called as the omega carbon, or it sometimes is also called as the methyl carbon. Alpha is the first alphabet in Greek and omega is the last one. So the first carbon is called as the alpha carbon and the last one is called as the omega carbon. Omega fatty acids are those which are unsaturated fatty acids and they contain double bonds in them. Many of these fatty acids, they contain several double bonds in them, so they are called as polyunsaturated fatty acids. This figure shows various important types of omega fatty acids. These are omega-3 fatty acids. Starting from the omega terminal or the methyl terminal of the fatty acid on carbon number 3, a double bond is present. So from the omega end, this is carbon 1, that's 2, and 3. So you can see that all of these fatty acids, they contain a double bond on the third carbon starting from the omega terminal of the molecule. The fatty acids shown in the panel below, they are called as omega-6 fatty acids. Starting from the omega end of the molecule 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So starting from the omega terminal or the methyl terminal of the molecule, they contain the first double bond on carbon number 6. This is a non-standard method of numbering the carbons. The standard method is to start the numbering from the carboxyl terminal. Glucosahexaenoic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid. Arachidonic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. The omega fatty acids are important because they have a beneficial effect on health. They are important for maintaining the health of cardiovascular system. They have anti-inflammatory properties. They also have a beneficial effect on liver and other parts of the body. Omega fatty acids, they regulate many different important functions of the cells and they have a beneficial health effect. So omega fatty acids, which are unsaturated fatty acids, have many important health benefits. For this reason, these omega fatty acids are included in infant formulations. For example, this is a packet of an infant formula milk and you can see here the term DHA, that is docosahexaenoic acid, ARA, which is the arachidonic acid. So these omega fatty acids are included in this infant milk formulation. One of the very important sources of omega fatty acids are the seafood. Several different types of fish, they are rich in omega fatty acids. So that is why fish are considered to be a very good dietary source of omega fatty acids. In addition, they are also a good source of proteins. But do not consume a lot of omega fatty acids, otherwise you may end up like this fellow. Or maybe like this. We will continue with the other type of lipids in the coming session.